She was already late when she stepped into the arrivals lane, the kind of late that makes every sound sharper and every decision faster than it should be. The airport buzzing with rolling suitcases and overhead announcements blurring into noise as she scanned the curb for the cardboard sign with her name on it, her grip tight around the handle of her scuffed carry-on, her pulse counting down the seconds. Because missing this pickup meant missing the interview, and missing the interview meant going back to the life she was trying to outrun. And when she finally spotted a man standing beside a black sedan, dressed simply, posture calm, eyes lowered to his phone, she made a choice she would remember for the rest of her life. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. She didn't hesitate after that. Not really, because airports teach you to move with confidence even when you're guessing. And she rolled her suitcase straight toward him, lifting a polite smile that carried more nerves than charm, and said, "Excuse me, are you the chauffeur for Miss Carter?" Her voice steady in a way her hands were not, the words landing between them like a harmless assumption, and the man looked up, surprised just long enough for something unreadable to flicker across his face, before it disappeared behind a neutral calm, his eyes taking her in not the way executives look at people, but the way people look at weather, curious and patient. And for a moment he could have corrected her, could have said there was a mistake, could have pointed her toward the curb where drivers held signs and assistants waved frantically. But instead he glanced at the traffic inching forward, at the clock glowing above the terminal doors, and made a quieter decision, one that cost him nothing in that moment and gave him something he hadn't had in years. He nodded once and said, "Yes, I can take you." His voice even, unadorned, and she exhaled without realizing she'd been holding her breath, thanking him too quickly as she handed over the suitcase, apologizing for the wait as if it mattered, as if she mattered, and he took it without comment, noticing the frayed zipper, the airline stickers layered like old scars, the way she watched him lift it as though measuring his effort. People don't really see drivers, do they? She said with a small, embarrassed laugh as he placed the bag in the trunk, and he paused, just a beat, then closed it gently and opened the door for her. "Not usually," he replied, and as they pulled away from the curb, the terminal glass sliding past like a reflection of a life she was leaving behind, she settled into the back seat and finally let herself talk, because she thought she was safe, because she thought he was invisible, telling him about the interview, about the flight she almost missed, about how she'd practiced answers in her head to keep from thinking about rent due next week, and he listened, really listened, the way he hadn't been listened to in boardrooms or on stages, the city unfolding ahead of them in miles and exits, the sedan quiet, her words filling it with something warmer than small talk, and with every mile, the mistake deepened, not as an error to be fixed, but as a door opening, one neither of them could yet see the other side of. The car merged onto the highway, the airport shrinking behind them as the city slowly took shape ahead, and for the first time since landing, she allowed herself to lean back against the seat, exhaustion settling into her shoulders as adrenaline faded, because the worst part of travel was never the flight, it was the moment right after, when reality rushed back in and reminded you why you were traveling in the first place. And she rubbed her palms together, glancing out the window at unfamiliar exits, then forward at the quiet man driving, assuming, without question, that he had done this 1,000 times before, ferrying important people from terminal to hotel, watching lives brush past him without ever touching his own. She broke the silence first, because silence made her thoughts louder, and she said she hoped the traffic would not be too bad, that she had an interview in less than 2 hours, that it was nothing glamorous, just an operations coordinator role at a mid-sized firm, but it meant health insurance, steady pay, maybe a way out, and she laughed lightly as she said that last part. The laugh people use when they do not want pity, and he listened, hands steady on the wheel, nodding once in a way that invited her to keep going. So she did, telling him she had flown in on a budget airline, that her suitcase barely made the weight limit, that she had rehearsed answers in her head all night because she could not afford to mess this up, because back home, rent did not care about effort, and bills did not wait for dreams. She apologized again for talking so much, saying drivers probably heard stories like hers all the time, and he surprised her by saying not really, that most people talked about meetings, deadlines, or complained about traffic, not about fear, not about hope, and she looked at him in the rearview mirror, noticing for the first time the lines of fatigue around his eyes, the calm that did not feel practiced, and she said, without thinking, "People probably forget you are even there," and he answered, honestly, that they usually did, and something in his tone made her pause, because it was not bitter, it was simply true. As miles passed, she shared more than she intended, about growing up moving from place to place, about learning early that asking for help came with conditions, about working 2 jobs while studying online, about how she learned to respect anyone who showed up on time and did the work, no matter the title, because dignity did not come from name badges. And as she spoke, he felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest, because no one had spoken to him like this in years, not without wanting something in return, not without knowing who he was supposed to be. And when she mentioned how people treated drivers like background noise, he remembered boardrooms where his words moved markets, where assistants waited for his nod, and he wondered when he had last been invisible, truly invisible, and why it suddenly felt like relief. They stopped at a red light, the city breathing around them, and she noticed his watch then, simple but well made, and quickly looked away, embarrassed at herself for noticing anything that might suggest she had misjudged him, because she did not want to be that person, the one who measured worth in accessories, and she said she appreciated him waiting for her at the curb, that not everyone would have, and he almost smiled, because he had not been waiting at all, but he let the misunderstanding stand, feeling the strange comfort of being useful without being recognized. When they pulled into the hotel drive, she felt a flicker of panic, because the moment was ending, because transitions always scared her more than beginnings, and she fumbled for her wallet, asking what she owed him, and he told her it was covered, that she should focus on her interview, and she hesitated, then thanked him, sincerely, stepping out with her suitcase and pausing before closing the door, saying she hoped whoever he drove next treated him kindly, because kindness should not depend on how important someone looked. And as the door closed and he pulled away, he realized that for the first time in a long while, someone had seen him clearly without knowing his name, and that small, mistaken ride had already shifted something neither of them knew how to put back. She stood in the hotel bathroom a few minutes later, smoothing the front of her blouse with damp hands, staring at her reflection as if it might offer reassurance. The mirror showing a woman who looked composed enough if you did not look too closely at the tension in her jaw, or the way her shoulders stayed slightly raised, ready to defend against disappointment. And she reminded herself that this interview was only one step, not a verdict on her worth, even though it felt like one, because when you had lived long enough counting dollars and hours, every opportunity carried the weight of survival. The interview itself passed in a blur of polite smiles and careful answers, of conference room chairs and water glasses, of questions she had practiced and questions she had not, and when it ended with a handshake and a promise to follow up, she walked back into the lobby with that familiar mix of relief and uncertainty, knowing she had done her best, but also knowing that best did not always mean enough. She sat down on a low couch near the window to wait for her phone to charge, pulling her suitcase close, fingers brushing the worn handle as if it were an anchor, and as she waited, her thoughts drifted back to the ride from the airport, to the strange ease she had felt talking to a man she believed she would never see again, to the way he had listened without interruption or judgment, and she wondered why that brief connection lingered more than the interview itself. Outside, traffic moved steadily, people arriving and leaving, each carrying their own silent stakes, and she took out a small notebook from her bag, flipping it open to a page filled with scribbled reminders and half-formed plans, because writing things down made them feel less fragile, and at the top of the page, almost without thinking, she wrote a single sentence she remembered saying in the car, about people forgetting drivers were there, and she underlined it once, unsure why it felt important, only that it did. Across town, the man she knew only as a chauffeur drove aimlessly for several minutes after leaving the hotel, passing exits he did not need to take, replaying the conversation in his head with a clarity that surprised him, because nothing of significance had happened on paper, no deals made, no headlines written, And yet something about being spoken to without expectation had unsettled him more than any hostile board meeting ever had. And when his phone buzzed with messages from assistants and partners, he did not answer right away, letting them wait, savoring the rare quiet of anonymity. He parked near a public overlook, engine idling, and for a moment simply watched the city, thinking about the small details he had noticed without meaning to. The way she apologized for talking too much. The way she measured respect by effort rather than status. The way she had wished kindness on someone she believed had none to spare. And he realized that those details had lodged themselves deeper than any pitch or presentation. Back at the hotel, she finally stood, shouldering her bag, checking her phone one last time before heading toward the elevator, when a folded piece of paper slipped from her notebook and landed on the floor, and she crouched quickly to pick it up, smoothing it out to see her own handwriting, messy but determined, listing next steps regardless of the interview outcome. Call this person, apply here, follow up. There, proof that she had learned not to hinge everything on one door opening. And as she tucked it back inside, she felt a quiet resolve settle in, the kind that came from surviving more closed doors than open ones. That night, as city lights flickered on and she lay on the unfamiliar bed staring at the ceiling, she replayed the day again. Not the interview questions or the answers she wished she had phrased differently, but the simple ride from the airport, the unexpected dignity of being heard. And she wondered, with a faint smile she did not fully understand, whether mistakes were always things to fix, or whether some were meant to leave a mark, small enough to overlook at first, but strong enough to change the direction of what came next. Morning came softly, filtered through hotel curtains that never fully blocked the city light. And she woke with the brief disorientation of not knowing where she was, followed by the heavier awareness of what the day might or might not bring. Because until an email arrived or a phone rang, everything remained suspended, and she dressed carefully, choosing comfort over polish, reminding herself that waiting was also a kind of work. She went downstairs not because she had anywhere to be, but because staying alone in the room made the silence louder, and the lobby cafe offered movement, background noise, the illusion that life was continuing whether she had news or not. She ordered the cheapest coffee on the menu, sitting near the window with her notebook open, pretending to review notes while watching people come and go, travelers with purpose, locals with routines, everyone seeming to know where they were headed, and she told herself that uncertainty did not mean failure, even if it felt uncomfortably close to it. Across town, the man she had mistaken for a chauffeur stood in a glass-walled conference room listening to numbers he had heard countless times before, forecasts and projections delivered with confidence. Yet his attention drifted, pulled back to the memory of a conversation that had nothing to do with margins or growth. And when the meeting ended, he surprised his team by postponing the next one, citing the need for fresh perspective, a phrase vague enough not to invite questions. He left the building alone, without an entourage, without a driver, something he rarely did anymore, and as he walked, he realized he was not heading anywhere specific, only toward the feeling of being unscheduled, unclaimed, and when his phone buzzed again, he ignored it, slipping it into his pocket as if it were an inconvenience rather than a lifeline. Back at the cafe, she packed up to leave, folding her notebook when she realized she had nowhere urgent to go, and on impulse she decided to take a walk, because moving helped her think. And as she stepped outside, the late morning air felt lighter than the night before, full of possibilities she was not sure she was allowed to claim yet. She had gone only a block when she heard her name, spoken with uncertainty, and she turned to see him standing several feet away, dressed much the same as before, casual, unassuming, holding 2 cups of coffee, one offered out almost tentatively, and for a second she was confused, then surprised, then smiling despite herself, because she had not expected to see him again, not really, and she asked if he was working, if she was causing trouble by distracting him, and he shook his head, saying he had a break, that he thought she might still be nearby, that he hoped it was not strange to say hello again. They stood awkwardly for a moment, then laughed, the shared discomfort easing something between them, and she accepted the coffee, thanking him, noticing again how natural it felt to talk to him without performing, without explaining herself. They walked slowly, cups warming their hands, talking about small things at first, the city, the weather, the strange rhythm of travel, and then, inevitably, about what came next for her. And she admitted she was waiting. That waiting was the hardest part, because it forced you to sit with hope without being able to act on it. And he listened, nodding, offering no platitudes, just presence, which felt like more than advice. He mentioned his own work in vague terms, saying he dealt with operations, with moving parts people rarely noticed unless something went wrong, and she smiled at that, saying it sounded familiar, that some of the most important work was invisible, and he felt a quiet recognition at her words, because they landed closer to truth than she knew. When they reached a small park near the hotel, they sat on a bench, the city noise softened by distance, and for a few minutes they said nothing, comfortable in the shared pause, and she realized then that this was what had stayed with her, not the ride itself, but the ease of being seen without being sized up. And when her phone finally buzzed with an email notification, she did not open it right away, breathing first, grounding herself, because no matter what it said, this moment was real, unconnected to outcomes. And as she slipped the phone back into her pocket, she caught his curious glance and smiled, saying she would read it later, that she wanted to finish the coffee while it was still warm, and he nodded, understanding more than she said, unaware that this second, unplanned meeting was tightening a thread neither of them would be able to ignore much longer. The days that followed slipped into a rhythm she did not plan but quietly welcomed, the kind that forms when two people keep finding reasons to cross paths without calling it intention. And after that morning in the park, they met again under ordinary excuses, a message asking if she wanted coffee while she waited, a suggestion to walk a few blocks instead of sitting still, small decisions that felt light, but added weight with each repetition. She told him the interview follow-up email finally came, polite and cautious, thanking her for her time, explaining they were still considering candidates, and she said it with a practiced calm that did not quite hide the disappointment underneath, and he listened the same way he always did, without rushing to soften it, without offering reassurances he could not guarantee, just acknowledging that waiting could feel worse than rejection because it kept you suspended between relief and loss. They walked through the city together, past storefronts and construction sites, through streets where life showed itself in fragments, and she pointed out places she liked, a bookstore with uneven shelves, a diner that served breakfast all day, places that felt honest because they did not pretend to be more than they were. And he paid attention, storing details he had never been trained to notice, the things people loved when they were not trying to impress. At one point, her shoe caught on a crack in the sidewalk, and he steadied her without thinking, his hand light on her elbow. Both of them laughing at the sudden clumsiness, and the contact lingered just long enough to register, not as romance, not yet, but as comfort, as the ease of someone being close without demand. She spoke about her past more openly now, about how she learned early to leave places before they left her, about packing life into bags that could be carried alone, about how independence was not a choice so much as a habit formed from necessity. And he shared small pieces of himself in return, carefully chosen truths wrapped in generalities, that he had spent most of his adult life working, that success was loud but often lonely, that being needed was not the same as being known, and she nodded at that, recognizing the difference instinctively. They shared meals that were simple and unremarkable, sandwiches eaten on park benches, takeout divided evenly because she insisted on paying her share, jokes about whose life was more predictable, whose future more uncertain, and each time they parted, it felt slightly harder, as if something unfinished hovered between them, unnamed but present. He noticed how she treated people, thanking servers by name, making space on sidewalks, noticing effort rather than outcome. And it struck him that she did not perform kindness, she lived it, unconcerned with whether it was seen or rewarded, and that realization unsettled him more deeply than admiration usually did. One afternoon, rain forced them under an awning, the city slowing around them, and she mentioned again how invisible some jobs felt, how people moved through life assuming support would simply appear when needed, and he felt the familiar pull of truth pressing against the lie he had chosen to maintain. The knowledge that every conversation rested on a foundation he had not been honest about, and for the first time, guilt surfaced alongside desire, quiet but insistent. He told himself he would explain soon, that timing mattered, that there was a right moment, but each time he imagined it, he saw the way her face might change, the recalibration she would be forced to make, and he delayed, not out of malice, but out of fear of losing the simplicity they had found. She, unaware of the weight behind his restraint, felt something new growing, a sense of being understood without having to translate herself, a closeness that did not ask her to be smaller or louder, just present, and she wondered if this was what connection was supposed to feel like, unforced, steady, built from moments that did not announce their importance until later. As the city lights came on one evening, and they stood outside the hotel where it had all begun, she realized she no longer counted the hours until departure or measured her worth by email notifications, because something else had taken root, fragile but real, and as he watched her smile at a passing thought, he knew that the longer he remained a stranger to her truth, the more the eventual reveal would cost them both, even as the bond between them continued to deepen, unaware of the test. Waiting just ahead. The invitation arrived without ceremony, tucked into her email among promotions and reminders, a formal request to attend an industry reception hosted by a firm connected to her interview, an opportunity she almost declined out of instinct before rereading it, realizing this was the kind of room you said yes to even when you felt out of place, because saying no too often was how doors quietly closed, and she mentioned it to him that evening as they walked, half joking that she did not own anything suitable, that she would probably stand by a wall and sip water, and he surprised her by encouraging her to go, telling her these rooms were less intimidating than they appeared, that sometimes the most important thing was simply showing up. The night of the event, she stood outside the venue adjusting the strap of her borrowed dress, reminding herself to breathe, the building glowing with light and confidence, people moving through the entrance as if they belonged there, and she felt the familiar tightening in her chest that came when worlds brushed against her own without invitation. Inside, the space hummed with conversation and polished laughter, glasses clinking, names exchanged, and she navigated carefully, nodding when spoken to, offering small smiles, grounding herself by focusing on the details she could control, her posture, her breath, the steady rhythm of her steps. She had just settled near the back of the room when the lights shifted slightly and attention moved toward the stage, and a host took the microphone, thanking sponsors, outlining the evening, and as applause rippled through the crowd, she listened with polite distance, not expecting anything to concern her directly. Then the host paused, smiling broadly, and announced the guest of honor, a name spoken clearly, confidently, a name she had heard before without attaching it to a face, a name associated with companies, headlines, and influence. And as the man stepped into the light, the room responded instantly, applause louder, phones lifting, people leaning forward, and she froze, her mind struggling to reconcile the image before her with the one she carried. Because the man standing there in a tailored suit, composed and assured, was the same man who had driven her from the airport, who had walked beside her through the city, who had listened to her fears without correcting her assumptions. The applause washed over her as realization landed not like shock but like impact, sudden and disorienting, memories rearranging themselves in her mind, the watch she had dismissed, the calm she had mistaken for simplicity, the way he had known when to speak and when to stay silent, and she felt heat rise to her face, a mix of embarrassment and something sharper, a sense of having been positioned without her consent. Around her, people murmured admiration, voices filled with respect, and she stood still, unseen in the crowd, watching him accept the attention with practiced ease, his eyes scanning the room as he spoke briefly, graciously, and then, impossibly, finding hers. The moment stretched, private despite the public setting, and she saw it then, the recognition, the regret, the unspoken acknowledgement of what he had allowed to happen, and before she could look away, he finished and stepped down, moving toward her with purpose as the crowd parted instinctively. He reached her just as the noise swelled again, and she met his gaze, steady despite the churn inside, and said quietly that she did not realize chauffeurs gave keynote speeches, her voice controlled but cool, and he did not deflect, did not pretend misunderstanding, only said her name, apologizing once, sincerely, without excuses. She told him she needed air, stepping past him into a quieter corridor, the noise fading as the door closed behind her, her thoughts finally catching up, anger mingling with disappointment, because it was not the wealth that unsettled her, It was the choice, the decision to let her speak freely under a false premise. He followed at a respectful distance, stopping when she turned, explaining that he never intended to deceive her, that he had wanted something simple, something real, and she challenged him with the question that mattered, asking whether any of it had been honest, whether the listening, the walks, the moments had been genuine or just an experiment in anonymity. He answered without hesitation that they were real, that she was real, and that was precisely why he had been wrong to delay the truth, and she absorbed his words, the weight of the room still pressing in from the other side of the wall, knowing that this reveal was not just about who he was, but about who she was to him, and whether trust, once shifted, could find its footing again. She did not raise her voice when she spoke to him in the quiet corridor, and that restraint hurt more than anger would have, because it meant she was choosing her words carefully, measuring them the way people do when something matters too much to waste on drama, and she told him that what unsettled her was not the money or the power or the applause echoing just beyond the door. It was the moment she realized every memory she had replayed in her head now came with an asterisk, a footnote she had not agreed to add. He listened, hands still, posture open, the confidence he wore on stage stripped away by the intimacy of consequence. And he said he understood why she felt misled, that he should have corrected the mistake sooner, that he had told himself he was protecting something fragile when in truth he had been protecting himself. She asked him whether he would have kept quiet if she had never walked into that room, whether he would have continued letting her believe he was someone else until she left the city, and the question landed between them like a test he could not study for, because the honest answer was complicated, and complication felt too close to excuse. He admitted that he had planned to tell her, that timing had become a way to postpone fear, and she responded that timing was not neutral, that it shaped trust whether people admitted it or not, because every day he stayed silent was a day she shared herself under assumptions that were not real. She told him she had spent years learning how to read rooms quickly, how to sense when she was being evaluated, managed, or overlooked, and that what she had valued about their time together was the absence of that feeling, the freedom to be unguarded, and now she wondered whether that freedom had been an illusion created by imbalance. He said that when she spoke to him as if he were invisible, it was the first time in years he felt present, not because he wanted to be underestimated, but because he wanted to be human without a role attached, and she countered that wanting something did not make the cost fair when someone else paid it unknowingly. The corridor felt narrower as the conversation deepened, the hum of the event muted but persistent, reminding them both that the world he belonged to was still waiting just beyond the door, and she asked him directly whether he had ever considered how easy it was for him to step out of that world and into hers, and how hard it would be for her to step into his without being changed by it. He did not deny the imbalance, did not minimize it, and that honesty slowed her breathing, though it did not erase the ache in her chest, because acknowledgement did not rewind time. She told him she needed space, not as a punishment, but as a way to hear her own thoughts again without the weight of revelation pressing on them. And he accepted that without argument, saying he would respect whatever boundary she set, even if it meant losing the connection they had built. As she walked back into the crowd to retrieve her coat, faces turned toward her briefly and then away, unaware of the shift that had just occurred, and she felt suddenly exhausted, not by the room, but by the recalibration required when truths arrived late. Outside, the night air cooled her skin, grounding her, and she stood still for a moment, letting the city noise remind her that life extended beyond one evening, one person, one choice. And when she finally left, she did so without looking back, carrying with her both the warmth of what had been real and the resolve not to let it be rewritten without her consent. While inside, he remained where she had left him, aware that the most difficult negotiation he had ever faced was no longer about markets or control, but about whether trust, once fractured by a single decision, could be rebuilt through action rather than explanation. The morning after the gala arrived without apology, gray and steady, and he woke with the clarity that comes when regret has already done its damage and all that remains is choice, because explanations would not bridge what he had broken, and words, no matter how carefully chosen, would sound like leverage coming from someone with too much of it. So he did what he had learned to do best when something mattered. He acted quietly and completely, starting with the smallest truth and following it through to the end. He remembered the sentence she had written and underlined, the one she spoke without realizing its weight, about invisible work and the dignity of effort. And he began there, calling people he trusted not to impress but to build, asking questions instead of issuing directives, listening the way she had taught him to listen, and by midday, he had put together something that did not carry his name at the front, something that solved a problem she lived with rather than one he could grandstand about. He reached out to the firm connected to her interview, not to influence the outcome, not to advocate for her candidacy, but to fund a pilot program they had shelved for lack of resources, an operations support initiative designed to stabilize teams rather than expand headlines. And he did it with conditions that stripped him of credit. No press, no announcements, no introductions, only accountability and timelines. Because if trust was to be rebuilt, it had to be done where applause could not reach. At the same time, he contacted the bookstore she had loved and the diner she pointed out, not to purchase them, not to brand them, but to underwrite training stipends for staff, paid hours for learning skills that kept places alive when margins thinned, and he set the payments to go out anonymously, knowing she would recognize the intent even if she never saw his signature. Days passed without contact, and he respected the silence, using it not as punishment but as instruction, because space had been her request, and honoring it was the first repair he could make. She spent those days recalibrating, returning borrowed clothes, resuming routines, checking her phone less often, telling herself that endings did not erase what had been real. And then an email arrived from the firm, not with a job offer, but with an invitation to consult on the new pilot, a short-term role focused on the exact kind of invisible work she understood, with clear pay, clear boundaries, and the option to decline without consequence. And she read it twice, puzzled, then again with a rising sense of recognition that felt like relief rather than surprise. She followed the thread outward, learning about stipends appearing quietly in places she knew, hearing gratitude expressed without spectacle, and the pattern became unmistakable, not a favor, not a rescue, but an alignment, and that difference mattered more than the scale of it. He did not show up at her door or flood her phone. Instead, he sent a single message, brief and unadorned, acknowledging the harm, naming the choice he had made, and stating the actions he had taken, making it clear they were not contingent on forgiveness or proximity, ending with a line that returned the decision to her entirely. When they finally met again, it was not at a gala or a boardroom, but at the small park near the hotel, the bench familiar now, the city moving as it always had, and she listened without interruption as he spoke plainly, owning the imbalance without dressing it up, explaining that what he offered was not a correction but a commitment to behave differently going forward. She asked him one question, whether he would continue these actions if she chose to walk away, and he answered yes without pause, because the point was not to keep her, but to keep the promise she had never asked him to make. The quiet that followed felt earned, and when she spoke, it was not absolution but clarity, that trust was not restored by scale but by consistency, that she would decide with time, not pressure, and he accepted that as the boundary it was. As they stood to leave, she noticed the small notebook in her bag and realized she had stopped underlining sentences, not because they no longer mattered, but because someone had finally treated them as instructions rather than inspiration, and in that recognition, something steady replaced the fracture, not closure yet, but the possibility of it, grounded not in wealth or apology, but in action that met her where she stood. Time did what neither apology nor distance could do alone. It softened the sharpest edges without dulling the truth, and over the weeks that followed, their lives continued forward, sometimes intersecting, sometimes running parallel, the new normal defined less by grand moments and more by consistency, by emails that arrived when promised, by programs that continued without his presence required, by trust rebuilt not through intensity, but through reliability. She accepted the consulting role with clear terms and clearer boundaries, stepping into work that felt aligned rather than bestowed. And as she moved through teams and systems, she recognized pieces of herself reflected back, the invisible labor finally named and supported, not because of who she knew, but because the work mattered. He kept his distance when it was asked of him and showed up when invited, learning to measure success not by proximity, but by impact, discovering that restraint could be a form of respect, and that leadership without spectacle required more discipline than command ever had. When they met, it was often in ordinary places, the park bench, the diner she loved, the bookstore aisle where conversations paused for passing strangers. And in those spaces, they spoke honestly about what had changed, about the cost of the mistake that brought them together, and about the unexpected clarity it had forced into both their lives. She told him that what allowed her to stay was not the scale of what he could do, but the way he had stepped back when asked, the way he had chosen to meet her world rather than pull her into his, and he listened, understanding that this was the true measure of the second chance she was offering. Months later, on an evening that felt intentionally unremarkable, he invited her to walk the same stretch of sidewalk where she had once stumbled, the city familiar now, and when they stopped, he did not kneel or gesture toward cameras. He simply took out a small, folded piece of paper, worn at the edges, and she recognized it instantly, the list she had dropped in the hotel lobby, the one he had picked up and kept, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of who she had been before she knew who he was. He told her that the biggest mistake he ever made was letting her believe he was smaller than he was, not because of money, but because of truth, and that the best decision he had made since was choosing to live at the scale of honesty she required, whether or not she chose to share a life with him. She did not answer right away, because this story had never been about urgency, and when she finally spoke, she said yes not to a promise of comfort or protection, but to a partnership defined by seeing and being seen, by choosing each other without disguises, without tests, without imbalance. The city moved around them as it always had, indifferent to conclusions, but for them, something settled into place, not as a fairy tale ending, but as a grounded beginning, rooted in the understanding that the mistake at the airport had not changed everything because of who he was, but because it revealed who they both chose to become when truth finally arrived.